All right. Hi, everybody. I'm Laura Bloomberg. I'm the Dean of the Humphrey School of Public Affairs, and I'm really glad you're all joining us today. This is the first of a summer-long Humphrey School seminar series, where we will be exploring timely and really important topics with scholars from inside the school. I'm so delighted that these two scholars are kicking us off with our inaugural seminar today. So throughout the summer, what you'll see is faculty members paired with members of our current student body, alums, and key partners focused on these issues. Today, you'll be hearing from Professor Joe Soss and doctoral student AshLee Smith. But before I turn it over to them, and I understand they'll be telling you about their backgrounds themselves, so you don't have to listen to me doing that. I'll leave that to them to do. But I want you to know that this seminar series will be offered every Thursday at the same time, and they will run between now and August 23rd. You will have more access to more information about these seminars on our website in the coming days, so check back often. If you have, now I need to read this part so I don't mess it up for all of you. If you have questions during the conversation, feel free to submit them through the Q&A feature on the bottom of your Zoom screen. And our panelists, AshLee and Joe, today have reserved time towards the end of the seminar to respond to those questions. So with that business out of the way, let me tell you that, as I said, I'm really proud that we have such esteemed scholars in our school who can offer these forums, and particularly today, it's great that we're kicking off with Professor Soss and AshLee Smith. They will be focusing on the topic, who's looting whom? Predatory plunder in the name of criminal justice. Over to you, AshLee and Joe.
Thank you.
Thanks, Laura. Hi, I'm AshLee. I'm a PhD candidate in public policy here at the Humphrey School, and I study poverty and inequality in the US with a focus on gender and race. So it's my pleasure to welcome Professor Joe Soss. He is the Cowles Chair for the Study of Public Policy here at the Humphrey School. His research and teaching explore the interplay of democratic politics, social inequities, and public policy. And he's particularly interested in political sources and consequences of policies that govern social marginality and shape life conditions for socially marginalized groups. So let's get started, Joe. So today, our discussion is titled, Who's Looting Whom? Can you say a little about your current book? What issue are you trying to raise with this question of who's looting whom, and how it relates to your current book project with Professor Josh Page, Preying on the Poor?
Sure, thanks. That's a great question. I want to start by saying thanks to the Humphrey School and to Dean Bloomberg for today, and to AshLee. Thank you so much for having this conversation with me. I think that the title for today's session, Who's Looting Whom, arises from the fact that, as groups of people who have been silenced and marginalized spill out into the streets and rise up to protest the conditions that they've been living under, one of the things that makes that very threatening to people in power and to authorities is that it's so hard to control. It's a very unstable sort of political action. One of the things that makes it effective is that fact. But one part of that is that people who are giving voice to those grievances, their actions in the streets often spill into taking and breaking behaviors and various other things. And in many cases, what gets happened is that gets labeled looting, and people use that in a sense to discredit or diminish what the protests are really about. So you see media and other observers saying, oh, well, this doesn't really seem about George Floyd or something like that in the recent events. And if you listen to people, if you are someone who is from one of these communities that has been heavily targeted for policing and experienced these injustices, if you listen to activists and residents from these communities, you know that there's a kind of bitter irony in this label of looting, because over the past several decades, really since the 1990s, police themselves have become sort of actors at the front lines of institutions that have been engaged in a very active and ongoing process of looting the communities that they police and punish. As the field opened up to private for-profit corporate actors, the criminal justice field, groups, organizations that were focused on revenue making from criminal justice. And as government rolled back taxes on the wealthy and on corporations, they became desperate for revenues in many cases, began to siphon them from the bottom up. And so police are at the front lines, really in many ways, of being out in the community, issuing fines and citations for all sorts of behaviors out in public, even for just moving around in public in poor communities of color, particularly Black communities, even bicycling, walking in the wrong way out in the street, driving, doing the normal things of life become occasions for takings. Police more and more use asset forfeiture procedures to seize people's cash or their cars or their goods in some way without even charging them as individuals with a crime. And when people get arrested and they get taken to court, they enter a whole new world where they're forced to pay fees for various court operations, and they take on legal financial obligations. And then they may find themselves in jail where they have to pay for phone calls and or electronic monitoring, and they get ushered into this expensive world of commercial bail where more money gets taken from their families and friends. And then, of course, prison. Where people get in prison or probation or parole, again, their pay-to-stay fees, basic necessities have to be purchased from commissaries. People are in all sorts of ways through e-tablets and through phone calls and you name it, money gets extracted. And all of that is before we even get to the issue of how people's bodies get used for free or cheap labor in prisons.
Yeah, thank you. So you're saying, all right, these criminal legal practices are being used in all sorts of ways to take money from communities. Can you say a little bit more about why you call these practices predatory, right? Like, are you trying to call out people who work in criminal justice as predators, or are you trying to make a different kind of point?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's clear that whenever we talk about something as being predatory in some way, that there's a negative connotation to that. Obviously, there's a sense of grievance and injustice, and we want that to be there. But I just want to start by saying that I think one of the really important purposes of sociological work, right, of thinking about society in sociological terms, is to get us beyond the focus on judging individuals in a moral way as good or bad people, right? And to move our focus to institutions and public policies and power relations that really organize social life and shape the kind of outcomes we experience in life. And so if I start with myself, I'm a professor at a university. I have all sorts of good intentions for wanting to do what I want to do. I like to think of myself as a good person. Someone else might see me as a bad person. But there's a bigger reality. I participate in an institution, the University of Minnesota, that is doing all sorts of things, some of which align with my personal morals and maybe some of which don't. Our point is to move the discussion away from is this person a good or bad person as a police officer to what is this thing in some sense and as an institution, and what does it do? And so there's basically three things we're trying to do with the notion of something, calling it predatory. The first is, as I say, to focus on the question of what is this set of institutions and what does it do? This thing we call criminal justice or criminal legal institutions. Most people think about it in terms of public safety or crime and punishment or things like that. And our attempt here is to say, look, it is also at the same time, even though authorities don't name it as such, and we don't think of it oftentimes as such, it has become a set of institutions that strips resources out of Black, brown, and indigenous communities that are quite poor disproportionately, and delivers them as revenues to government and profits to corporations, and is a major part of our system of inequality and sustaining our system of inequality in society. The second thing I think we're trying to do here is to connect this system, police and courts and prisons and jails and all of that, to a longer history, to say there have been many moments of predatory institutions in our history. We can look back to the institution of chattel slavery and the stealing of native lands. We can look at the history of colonialism and its various ways of taking of extraction in various forms. We can look at convict leasing in the era after the Civil War, and on. That this is one moment in which our criminal justice institutions have become very important in a particularly financial way for our systems for extraction, predation, sustaining social inequalities. And then lastly, we're trying to connect what's happening in criminal justice to the broader landscape. If you look at the broader landscape of what's happening today, right, what you find is that it's not just criminal justice. There are all sorts of predatory business models that usually focus on the exact same communities as predatory policing. So we get the payday lenders that charge usurious interest rates. We get all of the sorts of too good to be true credit card scams that focus on the same people, subprime mortgages and subprime car loans that the interest rates go up and up, furniture rental stores, all of these things, they all operate in the same way, which is just like criminal justice today. They impose debts on people who have very few resources, and then they trap those people in ongoing payment plans in which they are forced to constantly transfer the money they make through work or any other form to the state or to the businesses, far in excess of what they originally owed. There's a shared model across all of these things, and criminal justice is a part of that.
Thank you for that, Joe. So kind of following up on this shared model with imposing debts, can you say a little bit more about these consequences of funding, right, corporate profits and government budgets through criminal justice takings?
Sure. Yeah, that's a good question. I guess where I'd start when it comes to consequences is by saying that when we think about who's affected here, we tend to start with the individual who is arrested or put on trial or imprisoned. But when we think of, I think that's a mistake. You know, in all sorts of ways, criminal justice is about communities, right? If you look at the communities that are most heavily policed, you know, both socially in terms of groups and in terms of spatially in terms of neighborhoods, this is all organized by race and class in various ways. And if you look at who really pays the bill for people's bail, to support people while they're in prison and make sure they get their necessities and all those things, it's not the person who's been charged or convicted. It's actually most often women of color who are lower income. It's usually the moms and the aunties and the romantic partners and various people who are out in the community who step up and shoulder those burdens. So that's the first thing. The second thing in terms of consequences, aside from stop thinking about the individual, see the individual as an entry point for siphoning out of the community, right? The second point that I make is that we have to follow the kind of cascades, the rippling out. The most direct effect is that you're taking resources from some and delivering them to others in a form of upward redistribution that in a sense subsidizes the rest of society. Taxes are lower for supporting these massively expensive criminal justice operations, in part because they're funded partly through these takings, right? That money also finds its way into all sorts of other budgetary streams as well. But if you then follow the next level, what you find is that those financial takings produce all sorts of material hardships and crises in the lives of families and communities and individuals. And so you get evictions and you get utilities shut off and you get food deprivation. And as you follow it further, right, you find that there are significant both physical and mental health effects of carrying this burden of debt and the constant threats if there's non-payment. If you think about our institutions, of criminal justice institutions, one of the things that came out of the Ferguson report in the wake of the police killing of Michael Brown was that really the conversion of courts and the police and other institutions into revenue generating operations was deeply corrupting to the projects of public safety and the values of justice. In fact, what you find is local municipalities around the country have become deeply dependent on this source of revenue and find it quite hard to escape that. And what you find is that the marginalizing effects of all these takings are not just social and economic, they're also political. And so we've seen lots of practices and struggles over practices of saying, once you've served your time and fell in states where felony disenfranchisement would no longer apply to you, that you might be barred from voting in a county, or in the struggle in Florida at the state level, for the entire duration of when you haven't, until you've paid off all your fines and fees. And of course, many people are never able to do that. Right? In many ways, the relationship between the citizen and the state becomes reconfigured, remade, as people become addressed not as full citizens, but as debtors who can never pay their debt, in a sense, to the state and society.
Yeah, thank you for that. So going back a little bit to one of our first questions on the title of the session, right? Who's looting who? And connecting it to your book project, can you connect this to this current political moment with these uprisings and calls to restructure and defund the police?
Sure, I can reflect on that a little bit. I want to be careful here. People are out in the streets who are normally silenced and marginalized and prevented from having their voices heard. And I think we need to be very careful and very wary of people like academics stepping in and interpreting what's being said at this moment, imposing their voice in between, or trying to say what all of this means in some sense. So the first thing I want to say is how important that our major task at this moment is to listen and to participate. Not to sort of set ourselves up as expert interpreters in some sense. But I will say, I will make the connection that some people who study the kind of criminal justice takings that I've been talking about have referred to this as a kind of hidden system of taxation that people are not aware of, that this is going on. And I have to ask the question, hidden from whom? People in the communities that are targeted for this have known about this for a long time, and they've been speaking out for it for a long time. If people haven't known about it, if scholars have not been talking about it, it's because they've not been listening. If people in the rest of society have not known about it, it's in part because they have not been listening, right? And so part of what I want to say is that if you look back across the entire history of our nation's freedom struggles, from black, brown, and indigenous people, what you find is that policing in various ways and punishment in various ways have been at the center of those struggles time and time again, right? And when people talk about the failures of our policing models, they tend to talk about it in terms of over-policing and under-policing. Over-policing, the sort of routine harassment and violence and too much police presence saturating neighborhoods, stop and frisk and all of that. Under-policing in the sense of not really being effective at protecting people's lives and property and protecting public safety in the very same communities that are oversaturated with police. Those are important, but I think the discussion we've been having today is really about bringing a third element into that understanding problems of policing in communities that are subjugated by race and class is also really about understanding predation. And I think that's critical for understanding what for a long time people have been saying from targeted communities as they explain their frustration and anger with this system. So I think we have to keep this predatory dimension in mind as we go. Second of all, I would just point out that there is, in fact, although we don't know all of the connections in the case, or if there are connections in the case of George Floyd particularly, there are, in fact, deep connections between predation and police violence. When Michael Brown was killed by a police officer in Ferguson, Missouri, the Department of Justice did a report, and they quickly found that Michael Brown, who was sort of stopped for walking in a way across, in the street that was an occasion for a fine, had been made into a finable offense, in Ferguson, that Michael Brown lived in a city, in a place that had what the Department of Justice called a predatory system of government that was systematically using policing and courts to generate revenues. When Philando Castile was killed by a police officer here in Falcon Heights, here in the Twin Cities, investigations quickly turned up the fact that he in fact had $7,000 worth of criminal justice debt, all coming from minor violations of taillights and headlights and seatbelts, from driving to and from work and just around town. And half of those violations were actually for driving with a suspended license. The license was suspended because of the fines and fees he owed and couldn't pay off. And so he was confronted with having to drive to work to pay off those debts, but the only way he could drive was to do it with a suspended license. And so by raising the number of interactions between officers and people in communities, and by creating sort of fraught context for that, even more fraught, there is some connection here, although we can't draw very strong causal inferences at this point. And then the last thing I'd just say is that what we're talking about right now is defunding and dismantling the police in order to build something new, right? And it's a sort of opening of greater possibility right now. And in this moment, I think if we're going to talk about defunding, we need to keep at the front of our mind that the funding of police and criminal justice more generally is not just through taxes. It's through these sort of predatory practices. And we have to bear in mind that even with the increases in funding that have flowed toward criminal legal operations in recent decades, the growth of policing and punishment has been so fast and so large that the need has outstripped the resources they had. And that's part of why they turn to these siphoning predatory practices. So if we're going to defund, we need to be vigilant in thinking about how do these institutions usually respond when they don't have resources. They use their authorities and their powers in these ways. So we need to be sure to close that option off, right? And then lastly, I would just say the great history of reform efforts in this area has shown that there's always a group of corporate actors and privatization advocates who are eager for opportunities, constantly looking for opportunities to get new kinds of contracts. And that as we talked about dismantling municipal police forces and transferring to something different, there's going to be a very important set of debates we need to keep our eye on that center on what is the role of for-profit operations and what incentives can that introduce into the system to make the system more profitable for those at the top.
Well, thank you so much for that. We have a question that I think ties directly with this. Is this particular moment in criminal justice, do you think it's an aberration? You mentioned a little bit about the history of the predation framework that you guys talk about in your book. But is this the history of how criminal justice has been conceived and how it's operated for disadvantaged communities the entire time in the US, or was there a shift?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Thanks to whoever raised it. I think not to sound like I'm wiggling out of it, but really I think the right answer is that there's a great deal of change and there's a great deal of continuity. Criminal justice practices in this country have always been objects of political struggle. And they have always been used as tools of oppression in many ways and of domination. And so I would point to the fact that there have been many successful efforts to resist and change criminal justice practices. But I would say if you look back across the history, most of what we've seen are differently configured eras in which in some way or another policing and punishment have been used to maintain systems of labor extraction. And so if you go back to the slave patrols, right? Or if you go back to the early use of policing in the Northeast to suppress labor organizing and worker agitation, Or if you go to the convict leasing system after the Civil War, in which the state imprisoned particularly large numbers of Black people for things like new codes that they came up with, idleness and loitering and vagrancy and various things, and pushed them into, made them, incarcerated them, and then essentially sold them off, leased them off to make money for the state. To private actors, or the prison factories and prison labor in the North and the Midwest. All of these about labor, centered on labor. What's new here since the 1990s is an emergence of a system of financialization that emerged as the broader economy, political economy, was being financialized, that now a lot of what's going on is that this system is operating through financial takings, fines and fees and forfeitures, seizures, charges to people in prison. Prison labor has persisted and is important in probation and parole and prison contexts in a variety of ways, but it is really now decidedly the smaller portion of criminal justice predation relative to the financial side, which is where the big siphoning out happens in many ways. It is very significant, but it in many ways has been outpaced by the growth of these financial takings.
Thank you. So we have another question that asks about fines and fees, right? And if it's possible to have a fines and fees in our criminal justice system to change behavior. So this person mentions enforced traffic laws, things of that nature, without being inherently racialized and unfair.
Yeah. So the idea that there might be fines, that there might be some sort of penalty in the form of fines, does not inherently say that they have to be imposed in a way that centers on poorer communities or communities that are Black, brown, and indigenous disproportionately. The issue is that you have fines that are being implemented by a system that in itself, in all of its functions, disproportionately focuses on those communities. So there could potentially be various uses of fines that actually serve just causes. I mean, certainly we see many fines for fining corporations for violating various laws and regulations and things like that. There's all kinds of uses of fines, not inherently about this, but it's the expansion of these things to massive levels. Such that the injustice that's already been involved, when you see a sign that says that the penalty is 3 months in jail or $500 fine, what you're seeing is something that's saying the penalty is 3 months in jail unless you're wealthy enough to pay, right? And then you can avoid it. That injustice has been supercharged to the point now where fines are so ubiquitous and play such a role. Same with fees. And I just say that, again, we have to locate this in the historical moment. What has happened to criminal justice has been a particularly unjust and particularly egregious version of something that has been done to society as a whole. And so public support for public universities has declined and now comes way less from progressive taxation that leans toward asking more from the wealthy and from corporations. And it's now been individualized. And so in a sense, through the individual passing through they pay the tuition and fees for that service. We've come to expect that public parks get less public support from progressive taxation, and we're asked to pay for those services. When we go get anything from the DMV to any kind of service, more and more in this era, burdens have been shifted from some sort of progressive taxation and collective sort of payment system to the idea that the individual should pay. And in the criminal justice system, this has been supercharged by the idea that these are people who violated the law, who are in a sense enemies of society, people portrayed as deviants. And so very few people have objected to piling on the costs. In fact, many people have argued, why should people out in the community pay the cost of putting someone on trial who's, who's committed a crime. Well, number one, the reason they're on trial is because they haven't been convicted yet of committing any crime, and in many cases they haven't, right? And number two, systems of justice have historically, in many times, in many places, been understood as part of the common good, as part of the public system that we all are invested in our laws in some ways. And so this transfer we have to see, I think, as part of something much bigger.
Yeah, thank you for that. So you gave the example with Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, about him walking and it was a fine. Can you provide another example for the audience that goes through a fine and then the timeline of how this can evolve?
Evolve toward what?
Towards, right, this debt, this predatory system.
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, I think I gave two cases earlier, Michael Brown and Philando Castile. And I think in both cases, I think what I'm suggesting is not that there is sort of a one-to-one causal. Had there not been this, you wouldn't have had a police killing in this individual case. But in the case of Michael Brown, it's very clear that the pretext for the stop was something that is a rule about walking that is part of the kinds of new finable offenses that have just proliferated. I think in our chapter where we talk about this, we talk about one city where they have 27 different rules that you can be fined for walking in the wrong way. As you cross the street or if you do different. And what that does is it raises the number of interactions between police and people in the community. And particularly in a society that's marked by a great deal of racism and in interactions that are very fraught in various ways already, the more interactions you have, which are of course incentivized by needing to raise these revenues, the more interactions you have, the more possibilities you have for something to go wrong, right? And so when you see the situation, when you look at the situation with Philando Castile, what I'm saying is that it's important to understand that he was being pulled over just as he has been pulled over so many times before in a way that generates revenues, that's directly tied to this issue of predation. And that this was the one that went bad in a way that cost him his life at the hands of a police officer who's charged with protecting and serving the community, but has been pulled into a set of practices that are about raising revenues in many ways. And that we should understand that these things are interconnected in some sense, even if we don't have the kind of data we need to reliably estimate exactly what the causal impact here is.
Okay, yeah, thank you for that. So using this prediction framework, are there any implications in general policy in the US, social policy for targeting Black communities for current reform with other policy domains? So education, housing, that type of thing.
Yeah, I think that so part of what is going on right now with the dismantle and defund agenda is to say, look, many functions that we currently assign to police are better handled elsewhere. And in fact, many of these functions are in the past have been handled elsewhere. In fact, if you interview police, studies that talk to police officers aren't happy that they're being asked to do a lot of the things that they're doing now. As we retrenched social welfare services and supports, police and to some extent schools became almost the only game in town. And so everything got collapsed into them. We asked schools to do all this stuff. We asked police to do all this stuff. And the fact of the matter is that we want to separate out these functions in many cases. So if someone has an episode that's related to addiction or a mental health issue or a domestic dispute or something like that, it would be more effective to not send someone who is trained as an armed police officer to deal with violence in these ways and in many cases to respond with violence in many ways, but to spend people who are trained at and very good at dealing with those types of situations. In many respects, if we need some set of teams that would be armed to intervene in violent episodes as they're occurring, or to investigate violent episodes after they've happened, it would be a good thing to divorce those functions and those people from the day-to-day policing of people's lives in their community, so that they're not doing the same thing. And so in many ways, what we want to do is shift funding to these other institutions. And in so doing, we're shifting those functions to people who don't have the authority to oppose all of these fines and fees in this way. And so we're also shifting back toward needing to publicly fund these things.
So this question is a two-parter, and it's going to ask about extraction. So one, have you or anyone you know done anything to assess the amount of public revenue generated from fines and fees here in Minnesota? And then two, what are kind of the indicators of resource extraction in communities? Is it race, poverty, that type of thing?
What are the predictors of who gets money taken from them? Yeah. So on the first question, we have there are not good national numbers that total all of this up. But we have various numbers that give us some sense of parts and pieces of it. Recently, it was suggested that $900 million a year was taken through fines and fees, forfeitures in New York City, for example. There have been some very good studies of the amount of money generated by the prison telecom industry, which is a multi-billion-dollar industry, with a set of large players. The bail industry has been studied, and again, it's a multi-billion-dollar industry with most of the funds going up to a set of large insurers. Big insurance corporations, those mom and pop bail companies are the sort of extraction points for money that goes up in various ways. So there's all kinds of estimates in different places in different ways. I think that Chicago makes something like 7% of its total annual budget just from car-related fines and fees alone, and impoundments and things like that. So these are substantial amounts. And what we know is that these things are very focused, strongly focused by class and by race and by gender. And so if you look at, Chicago, biking is very popular all over Chicago. But if you look at bike tickets by neighborhoods, 8 of the 10 most heavily ticketed neighborhoods are poor communities of color. Right? Poor neighborhoods of color. We just see this over and over again. Activities that are quite common among all groups are much more fined and subject to fees and forfeitures and all those things in those areas. It's repeated. And then in terms of the gender element, I'll just point out that our best estimates are that 83% of the adults who are paying costs for someone in prison are adult women, right? And particularly women of color. Because of the composition of who's most policed and arrested and incarcerated, right? And so we have a pretty good sense of who the money is being taken from, and we are able to trace it out into its various streams, budgets, and corporate and shareholder profits as well.
Yeah, so that was a perfect segue into a question about gender. So you mentioned women are the ones paying the fines, right? Because men are the ones being arrested and getting on bail, et cetera, et cetera. Can you say a little bit more about this, and if you have any correlations or causations of why women and why these women?
Great, thanks. That's a really good question because gender is so often ignored. To the extent that we're sort of conscious of gender when it comes to criminal justice, usually the focus is on why Black men especially, but all that white prisoners, people who are arrested, are disproportionately men, especially men from Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities. The other side of that is that when we turn to the financial side in particular, it's disproportionately poorer women of color, a little bit older in some sense. Now, why is that? One of the things that's helpful in our project is that in addition to looking at the numbers and the histories and the institutions, we did some ethnographic work. My co-author and friend, Josh Page, worked as a bail bond agent for about 1.5 years to learn about how this industry worked. And one of the things that he discovered and that we've written about in RSF, which is the Russell Sage Foundation Journal, is that Basically, when someone would be put in jail, they would be desperate to get out, of course. Jail's an awful place. It's much worse than prison in many respects because it's not designed for people to be there long term. There's less opportunities to do things, even than prison. The conditions tend to be very bad. But when people are in jail, they're missing work and they're unable to take care of their kids, or they're missing school, or there's all sorts of things in their lives that are falling into crisis every day they're there. And so they're desperate to get out, and the only way they can get out is to be bailed out in most cases. And increasingly in recent decades, there are financial conditions of bail which have grown, right? And who is going to do that? Who is going to step in and shoulder that burden for this person who's in jail? Well, at the bail agency, the routine response, yet, right? Because the way care relations are organized in our society, women are expected disproportionately to do care work, to take care of the problems, to feel a sense of obligation. The people who worked at the bail agency expected that the mom or the aunt or the sister would feel like they had to do something about it, right? And disproportionately, they went after those women because they expected them to feel a duty of care. In a sense, what they were doing was financializing the ethic of care, which is deeply gendered, and the expectations and roles and norms in our society that leads across a variety of arenas for women to do a disproportionate amount of this work.
Thank you for offering your perspective on that. So Jeremy Gordon asked how can we make a case given the calls to defund when your research really calls for a reconfiguration of funding streams? So he mentions, right, that we need to push for policies that fund criminal justice systems through progressive taxation. That's his take on this, by raising taxes. But if we're trying to defund the police, how can your research really reconfigure these funding streams? I think you talked a little bit about this earlier, but if you could just say a little bit more.
That's great. That's a really, really important question given our current political moment. What I would say is that defunding the police is fundamentally about reallocating funding. And it's about getting away from the idea that the only or the best response to crime is policing and punishment. In fact, anti-crime initiatives are frequently best pursued through social investments that attack the underpinnings of, and labor market reforms and various things that make work pay, that make good work available, that invest in education, invest in social services, invest in all these things. Those are anti-crime initiatives. Those are public safety initiatives, and we need to understand them as such. Defunding the police, which eats up a huge percentage, like half in many places, 40% in many places of the total local budget. Moving funds away from that is an essential step toward funding other solutions to crime and to public safety. And the idea then is to take the funding that continues to be directly invested in investigations of violent crime and efforts to cease violent crime in process, to invest those in something that really doesn't look like our police today, right? Our police today is this sprawling institution, this sprawling set of practices that saturates poor communities of color, and that is what needs to be defunded. So there will be other kinds of funding, absolutely. We're not simply zeroing out budgets. Before I move on, just simply cutting funding on its own is not a good idea for several reasons if nothing else is done. First of all, as I said, it pushes criminal justice institutions and operations into more predatory practices to fill in the revenue needs, right? But second of all, because of contracts that specify last hired, first fired, what you also do is frequently putting pressure on to get rid of the youngest and oftentimes most progressive, most open to change officers, and protecting those who have been there longest and are most entrenched in the institution. So we have to be very careful about how we handle all of this and recognize that dismantling and defunding is about starting a process of rebuilding, redeveloping, redesigning. It's in many ways a call to kind of civic imagination of what are the other ways that we can approach public safety.
Thank you. So I'm not sure if you have read anything about this, but Governor Walz and Attorney General Ellison, right? They had this conference recently talking about how they're making recommendations for reform. And Cheryl Bailey asked us, do we know of this about, is there any type of policy change or recommendations from them or in any other states to kind of block police departments from preying on the poor financially?
Yeah, so in fact, one of the things that's very exciting in many ways about, one of the things that's very exciting about our moment is that disruptive politics, disruptive protest changes the playing field of politics. And there are new possibilities right now that have not really seemed like possibilities before. In some cases weren't even thinkable as something that could be seriously pursued and likely to matter politically for policy outcomes. So that's exciting. But the thing about working on these issues of predation is that it's an area that, for me at least, is filled with, at the same time, there's a great deep sense of injustice and anger about what's happening. It's also an area of hope. There have been a lot of important victories in recent years in various ways, from litigation and strategies and the Supreme Court victory that curbed some of the asset forfeiture practices. There have been efforts in various communities to pursue ability to pay constraints that say that you can't impose and collect fees and various things, or bail outside of, that beyond a person's ability to pay. There have been efforts to try to attack prison phone charges in various ways and to regulate those. We have all sorts of policy levers at our disposal, and people are pursuing them vigorously, and they're winning in some cases. And I think that we have more momentum now with our current political moment. What I'd say is, remember that what we're talking about is a system that in the main has really been constructed since the 1990s. So within the living memory of large numbers of people in this country, the system did not work this way. We have we know what this system looks like without this part of it operating at a huge level, seeing it at a very small level. So it's not a fantasy. It doesn't require imagining some utopia to imagine this not existing, it being forbidden, it being regulated. And we have many good ideas for doing so and a lot of energy behind that.
So one type of policy intervention, someone asked, would it be okay and a good use of this kind of extraordinary windfall from bailout organizations have received across the country, is to kind of just forgive the fines and fees? Is that a good solution to this problem?
Yeah, so, I want to distinguish the bail funds, which try to pay people's bail, which are a positive intervention and help people in very important ways. I want to distinguish that from actually changing the system. I mean, what you're essentially doing is raising more money to give to the corporations, the insurance companies at the top of this industry. You're going out and raising money for them. Now, you're doing it in a way that really helps someone who's been jailed and their families and their children. And, it's so important in so many ways, but it's not about system change in some way. And I also want to distinguish the real kind of changes that we need in the bail area from, liberals in particular in this area tend to really want to focus on commercial bail. And that's an important thing to focus on. We're one of only 2 countries in the world that allows for this for-profit commercial industry. The other is the Philippines. That for someone who's been jailed in order to get them out, and so that's important. But part of what Josh and I are trying to emphasize here is that this is really a predatory public-private partnership, and that government is just as involved in all these taking operations. And so if you take out the for-profit aspect from the commercial bail industry, governments have shown themselves to be quite willing to do this. What we really need in the bail area is to get the financial conditions of bail out of there. We need to stop imposing, we need to stop making how much money you have access to a condition for getting out of jail pre-trial when you haven't been convicted of anything. There are many other conditions, and they're equally effective, many other conditions you can set on bail. Mass forgiveness and amnesty of legal financial obligations is a terrific idea. It would be an incredible targeted investment, in a sense, and sort of liberation for communities that have been disproportionately targeted. But they would have to be paired with putting an end to the practices themselves. Otherwise, those debts are just going to be recreated and returned in some sense. So absolutely, I think that kind of debt forgiveness should be on the agenda. And I think it should also paired with broader reforms and restrictions or reinventions of the system that prevent this from continuing. That's part of, I think, the dismantle and defund idea.
Thank you for that. So audience, we have room for one more question if you want to put it in the box. Right now, Joe, I'm going to ask you about, it's from an attendee who wants to know, is there any research in this area and on youth, right? Are bails and fines seen within the juvenile system? Are they lowered or do they not exist? And they also mentioned that although we've seen a lot of political disruptions about criminal justice and police, it's really focused on adults. Has there been any change or public call in being focused on youth?
Yeah, yes to both. The juvenile criminal legal systems have been a site of a huge amount of financial extraction. In fact, pay-to-stay fees have been forcing people to pay for their own imprisonment or detention has been, the juvenile justice area has been central to that. And with parents being forced for years or decades to pay off debts accrued for their children being put under custody for a prolonged period of time, or even for short stays in various ways. So again, if you think about it at an individual level, it's the youth, it's the young people, but really that's the occasion for siphoning from the parents, from the family. So, and you see this across the board. I will say, because in many ways, in some respects, leveraging the more sympathetic image of young people and a slightly more access to forgiveness for, what's thought of as mistakes in some sense, that there have also been some real victories in the case of juvenile predation in the criminal legal area. So that's an area that's very active in both senses.
Thanks for addressing that. So our last question before we wrap up is kind of on your views of a solution to this. And you've mentioned throughout defunding the police or reinvesting, right, in different items. But what are some policy interventions that you think these jurisdictions could start taking to address these issues? And then is there any connection for policy change within other policy areas that affect this, like housing policy?
Yeah. So I'll start by saying that reform has been historically, efforts to reform the police, pushes to reform the police have often been the occasion for greater investment in the police and oftentimes greater profit making. So with the wave of Black Lives Matter protests, one of the things that came out of that was, and immediately the Obama administration sort of pushed the idea of investing more money, and they released a lot of federal money to invest in body cameras. And body cameras became a huge new investment site and site of profitability for a whole lot of private corporations that in many cases actually were willing to provide the body cameras for free in order to land the contracts for managing all of that video storage and all of that. And of course, at the same time, a lot of those body cameras, people were hoping for a technological solution to a political problem. Really what happened with a lot of those body cameras was that they increased the ability to have surveillance. Increased police surveillance in the communities, and in many cases where police controlled those videos, they were not released. In cases where unless they work to the advantage of the arresting officers. If you look at a lot of our cases where video has mattered, it's been ordinary people with cell phones who've actually taken those videos first and foremost, and then forced the release of some of the body camera footage. We can look time and again in other cases that we have to be careful about reforms that wind up being moneymakers in one way or another, or increasing investments in the police and in punishment. I think that if we look to the policy solutions, that a major part of what we need to do is to push for more progressive taxation and more social investment in communities that have really been exploited in various ways and oppressed in this country for a very long time. And we have undercut and transformed a lot of our systems of social welfare and of housing and of all of those things, mental health services, all of that. But I also think it's equally important to go right to the source of this thing, if not more important. I think the call right now to people, oftentimes react to this as a very radical idea. And sometimes people are put off by the language of defund or abolition or dismantle. But if you really look at what people are saying, they're saying that this is an elephant and we want a giraffe. And you can't turn an elephant into a giraffe, no matter how many different things you do to it, right? What we need is to get rid of the elephant and start working on getting a giraffe for ourselves, right? And I think that here what's really important is to not confuse the institutions that currently fulfill certain functions, like dealing with violent episodes, with the functions themselves. This institution, when we think about dismantling or abolishing this institution, we are not talking about let's just forget about doing anything about this problem. Let's not enforce laws. Let's not do any of these things. What we're talking about is trying to fulfill those functions in a very different way, because what we have built in this country is a massive system of policing and adjudication and punishment with world historic levels of incarceration that is also functioning at the same time as a really central mechanism for maintaining and deepening social inequalities in our country. And what we need to abolish, what we need to dismantle is that system. And we need to figure out new ways to meet the functions, the real needs that we have in a society that don't do that.
Well, thank you so much, Joe. It's been great to chat with you about your book, about the predation framework and how it connects to our current political moment. So thank you again. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you to everyone who watched today and asked questions. It was nice to have the opportunity to talk about these issues.
All right, bye. Thanks.
Thank you.